All right. This is going to serve as the intro to the red pill. And to really understand the red pill, you have to understand some of the background why, number one, the policy or the feminist policies actually came about as far as a government policy, because feminism is a government policy. Title IX and Title X were government policies. And without some background about why these policies were passed, then the rest of my presentation is not going to make much sense. So to give you some background, which is possibly helpful because demographics in itself is a very well studied science, especially since the Industrial Revolution, and it has been a very good predictor of social changes and even social upheaval. We're actually going through it now in Western Europe and part in basically America. All your Western world is basically going through a demographic cycle. But to kind of blend in why demographics are important to the red pill and feminism and the kind of stuff that we're going through, we're going to have a little background in demographics. So we're going to start with population pyramids and the demographic transition model. Briefly, what a population pyramid is a graph that shows the population of a country according to sex and cohort. These graphs can help predict future population trends. Cohort, an age group made up of 5 years used in describing a population pyramid. An expansive population pyramids, countries with a high birth rate but rapidly declining death rate. Stationary population pyramids, countries where both birth and deaths are very low. Demographic transition model. Graph outlining a country's natural increase as a result of birth and death rates, therefore showing changes in population as a result of a country's economic development. The model is based on the changing population of Western Europe during industrialization. In other words, as far as a study, demographics is very new because before the Industrial Revolution, populations were fairly stable. They've changed very slowly. This is your basic population pyramid. As you can see, you got boys on the right, you got girls on the left. I should say boys on the left, girls on the right, excuse me. And you have your cohorts, which are age blocks that make up your pyramid. Like you said, in groups of 5 years, divided by sex. And normally, as we're going to see in the next slide, you have either a percentage or a number at the bottom, along the scale on the bottom. They give you an idea. And then you're going to have an age, like you said, they have an age range going out either down the middle or to the side. This is your basic pre-industrial population pyramid. Like I said, the this one has the population. It could be in millions, it could be in thousands, it could be hundreds of thousands. This is your basic population scale. Like I said, some pyramids have a percentage at the bottom to let you know what percentage of the population that each cohort makes up, which I like better, is a percentage. Because it gives you kind of a mix of how many, or where you are as far as is in that curve, as far as the population pyramid. You could use it for lots of things. You see the age scale going up the side, and this is normal in the pre-industrial because you have the biggest block of people below 20. That's a very young population. That is pre-industrial. Very young population. In fact, the pyramid is actually skinnier because a lot of your kids don't make it up past the age of 10. So they have a very high mortality rate for children down at the bottom. And also a high mortality rate at the top. Because as you go up, you can see very few people actually live into old age, which is past 50 years old, which is the opposite of what a modern post-industrial population pyramid looks like. The next slide. This is the demographic transition model in 4 stages. There's actually a 5th stage, which is the one that looks like a snow cone, which is the one that's very recent, which is a lot of Western Europe is going through, and even Japan, where you have a very, very small birth rate and a very, very low mortality rate at the top, so where it's almost like an inverse pyramid. I call it a snow cone. Well, we're not going to show the 5th one on this model. We're just going to concentrate on the 4. Okay, stage 1, high birth rate, rapid fall in each upward age group due to high death rates, short life expectancy, which is the first one we saw, which is a very pre-industrial or expanding stage 1. Stage 2, high birth rate, fall in death rate as more living into middle age, slightly longer life expectancy. This is your industrialization stage. Declining birth rate, low death rate, more people living to old age, which is stationary. And number 4, low birth rate, low death rate, higher dependency ratio, longer life expectancy, which is your contracting phase, your contraction phase. And in accordance, stage 1 is pre-industrial, or some people call it primitive. Those are your developing nations. Transitional, these are industrialization. These are your baby industrialization nations, such as Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya. You see that going on right now. In the 1970s, it was Korea, it was China, it was Japan was actually before that, but Singapore, a lot of Latin America was in the transitional phase in the 1970s. Industrial, these are the fully mature industrial nations. These are your either first world nations or near first world nations. Where you have a declining birth rate and a low death rate and more people living in old age, fully mature. And your last one is your contraction, which is post-industrial, which a lot of your first world nations are right now. And in the next slide, I'm actually going to show you the different cycles as they pertain to social development and social upheaval. Which is a pre-industrial is A. Transitional is B. The B cycle is very, very important, as you're going to see. In fact, your B cycle is important to what we're talking about. Your industrial is your C cycle. Your post-industrial is your D cycle. Next slide. This is from Quigley, Carol Quigley's Tragedy and Hope. It's your demographic cycle. You see your A, your B, your C, and your D. And you see your B cycle right there. But like I say, your A cycle is your pre-industrial primitive society, like I was saying, many below the age of 18 or many below the age of 20. That's your age distribution. Your B cycle, high birth rate, falling death rate, and your numbers that are exploding. This is your explosive phase. This is going to be very important in the next slide. Many in your prime. In other words, childbearing, because women bear children, you have wombs. Wombs produce more kids. That means your population will explode because your wombs are your human resource factories. Your fertility rate will probably go up because your children, you're going to have actually more children survive. So your fertility rate will go up. But here's the part where it's important to us. Many in your prime, 1845, are your arms bearing years. Why is that important? Women produce wombs, produce children. Men carry arms, and they oppose the social order or change the social order. So if there's going to be a change in the social order, it's going to come in the B cycle. C cycle. Birth rate is falling. Death rate is low. Numbers are stable. In other words, you're not growing. Many middle-aged, over 30. In other words, you don't have that young energy anymore. After 30, you start raising children. You start going to work. You're less concerned about doing what? Opposing the environment, opposing the social order. And lastly, D is the geriatric. In other words, this is your contraction phase. This worries a lot of countries because this is the time that you have to worry about security because you don't have the numbers to protect your country. You don't have the numbers to actually provide a security force. You don't have the numbers to actually grow your economy. This is your growth. Your B is your growth phase, but it's also the most explosive and most worrisome phase for the managers of society or the leaders of society, for lack of a better term. So like I said, we're going to concentrate on this. This is very important. Out of all the information you hear, or the slides, the demographics, these people, these boys or these men from 1845 in arms bearing years, especially in an explosive cycle like the B cycle, is very, very important. And you're going to see this in the next slide. This is the diffusion of the demographic cycle. This is also from Carol Quigley's Tragedy and Hope. Notice the B cycles. Your A cycles are pre-industrial, but your explosive cycles here in B, this is when England, the English Empire, in the B cycle was actually formed. In the late 1700s, early 1800s, this is when the British Empire was born. It actually defeated the French. But also at the same time, you had a conflict with the French because at the same time you had the same cycle, the same B cycle, or a growing phase right after that with the French, the Napoleons. Napoleon Bonaparte 1, 2, and 3 were actually born during this. This is when the French actually took over Europe or dominated Europe. But you notice these B cycles together are the age of conflict. In the 1900s, with the German B cycle, what happened? World War I and World War II. One under the Kaiser, one under Hitler. Next one, going down to 1950, the 1940s to the 1950s, basically. Who defeated the Germans, the Americans, and also with the Soviets, Soviet Cold War? Who actually affected Europe mostly in the 1950s? It was the Soviets. During the B cycle. And the beginning of the B cycle was also where? In Asia. Chinese. Where's all the energy now? Where's the B cycle or the former B cycle? And where has all the wealth gone to? Where'd the rise go to? Asia, China, B cycle. Now, Carroll Quigley wrote this book back in 1964. How did he know that there's going to be Asiatic rise in the year 2000? Demographics. Why is that important to us? This is the birth rates from 1909 to 2009. You've probably seen this graph before many times. This is the birth rates of the United States. Now, this here is the end of the 1800s or the 19th century B cycle, where you had the highest birth rates. Now, you have a natural decline, a natural fall off into an industrialized nation. But you had a depression, and what happened after World War II? You had another B cycle right there. It's called your baby boomers. What happens during a B cycle? You have what? Arms-bearing boys. You have arms, you have boys. You have arms-bearing boys. You have males that do what? Oppose the social order. Your biggest group of boys ever born in the United States were right there, which are your baby boomers. So, if there's going to be anything to be done, anything to be opposed in the United States, who's going to do it? It's going to be them. It doesn't make sense looking at a chart. Look at the next cycle. This is the population pyramid from 1950 to 1960. 2010, excuse me. You see this bulge right here? See that bulge? That is your baby boomers working their way up the line. These boys, this group of boys actually started to change society, especially during the 60s. This is your civil rights and your anti-war protesters. You can actually see it as these kids come of age, especially in 1960s. See these two cohorts? These kids are actually becoming 18, 19, and 20. And that's where your marches come through. This is where your protests are actually happening, right till 1970 until they mature. In 1972, this is where your second cohort of children, because there's four cohorts in the baby boomers. Second cohort's actually rising, right? So what do they need to do? They see what the first two cohorts do. They need to do what? Tamp down in the second two. They're seeing what the first two have already done. So in a moment, I'm going to show you exactly what the results of this cohort of these arms-bearing boys actually did in the United States. Now, the first full cohort of the baby boomers was in 1950, where all the children were between the ages of 0 and 5. Now, as we step through this, you can see the bulge of the baby boomers starting to form. 1960, you have the first three blocks of the baby boomer bulge already present. And you can see the stair step, how year after year the number of the baby boomers increase. You can also see how much larger each of these cohorts, the three cohorts of the baby boomers, are than the blocks above them. In 1963, you can see the first of the baby boomers are now coming into what we call their prime, or their arms-bearing years for the boys. The first of the baby boomers have turned 18 years old and they're now students. This is the first year of unrest under Kennedy's administration. He had promised civil rights legislation, but he wasn't moving fast enough. So you had sit-ins, you had protests, increased protests in the South, and it all culminated with the March on Washington in 1963. By 1965, even after the civil rights legislation, you still had unrest. You had your first three major riots in 1964, culminating with the largest of the riots in 1965 in Watts in Los Angeles. 1967, you can see as the baby boomer worked their way up into the population, where they're in their 20s now, and the first of the second cohort is now entering into its arms-bearing years. 1967, you had the largest amounts of riots on record in the hot summer of 1967. 1968, you had the Martin Luther King riots, and you had the Chicago Vietnam riots and the student protests all across the country. By 1967, all your cohorts have finished, and your first two cohorts of the baby boomers have come of age. You've had all the student protests, with Kent State being the major one, and the funny thing is, the largest two cohorts haven't even come of age yet. So that's the background that we're looking at. Now imagine that this is 1970 and you're a policymaker in the Nixon administration, and you just lived through the most tumultuous 10 years that the United States has ever seen in its history. Imagine that you have just seen 30 years of successful socialist policy that was first started by Franklin Delano Roosevelt turned on its head and completely rejected by the masses. You've just seen one administration overturned and yours severely rocked. All this turbulence fueled by the power of the baby boom generation. Now imagine that you're looking at the demographics, and all this turmoil was caused by only half of the baby boom generation, and the other half is coming up. What is it that you plan to do? Everything that you have tried has been to double up on more of the same, give them more, distribute more wealth, create more jobs, appease more people and more segments of the population, all to no avail. And you're looking at a problem that potentially can only get worse. The seeds of disobedience had been sown, and they were spreading like a virus throughout the population. And every attempt that you have tried so far has failed to cure the population of this troublesome affliction. A new and different solution and policy must be found before it's too late. Because if the other half joins them, there will be no cure, no possible cure for this outburst or this outbreak of disobedience that is so infecting the West and the United States in general. If the select is to be saved, drastic measures must be taken. You're going to have to think out of the box and do something completely different, something that's never been tried before. In the next episode, we're going to talk about what I think is the solution that they came up with.